You're taking my money all over town, placing bets.
I'm having very serious second thoughts.
Are you serious right now?
I know I fucked up.
Howard, where's the money right now?
Howard, got my money? Howard!
Is it too late?
The clip you just watched is from the movie Uncut Gems, which follows a jeweler in New York City who also happens to have a crippling gambling addiction. If you've seen the film before, you probably agree with me that the entire thing is about as anxiety-inducing as a movie can be. It also shows the terrifying reality of gambling addiction and disorder, which will be the focus of my video today. The DSM-5 defines a gambling disorder as A, persistent and recurrent problematic gambling behavior leading to clinically significant impairment or distress, as indicated by the individual exhibiting 4 or more of the following in a 12-month period. And up here is a list of some of the things that gambling addicts may display. So things like they need to gamble with increasing amounts of money in order to achieve the desired excitement. They're often preoccupied with gambling. After losing money, they return another day to chase losses or get even. They will, rely on others to provide money to continue their habit. And then B, the second part, is the gambling behavior is not better explained by a manic episode. Gambling addiction has the highest suicide rate of any addiction. This study from Marino and Nikkanen found that between 22 and 81% of gamblers in clinical treatment have suicidal ideation, and between 7 and 30% of them have attempted suicide. Gambling addiction is also relatively common, particularly in the US. The National Council on Problem Gambling estimates that around 2 million adults suffer from severe gambling problems, and another 4 to 6 million adults have mild or moderate problems. So gambling disorders are clearly a significant threat to the well-being of millions of adults in the US. Gambling is also becoming much more accepted in American culture. Seemingly every sports game you turn on nowadays has FanDuel or DraftKings ads, and 36 states have legalized sports betting since the Supreme Court's 2018 ruling, which allowed them to do so. Financial apps like Robinhood and Webull also allow retail investors to borrow massive amounts of margin, which allows people without any financial knowledge to use more money than they actually have to gamble on complex financial derivatives with zero oversight. In fact, I regularly receive emails from TD Ameritrade offering me up to $25,000 in margin, despite the fact that I have stated my yearly income is far below that threshold. I chose to analyze gambling addictions and disorders through Bortolotti and Broom's Mental Illness as Mental, in defense of psychological realism. Before I begin my analysis, let's quickly break down Bortolotti and Broom's paper and the argument they present within it. Bortolotti and Broom want to push back against this notion that psychiatric disorders must have some sort of underlying biopathological malfunction in the same way that physical diseases do. Instead, they argue that a proper understanding of psychiatric disorders requires us to realize that the very conceptualization of mental illness relies on moral, social, and epistemic norms. Essentially, things like rationality and self-knowledge within a person, as well as the external social environment around a person, give us the very basis through which we diagnose and detect mental illness. Therefore, our conception of mental illness necessarily takes into account these external and non-biological factors. So why would we assume that all mental disorders have some underlying biological cause? On page 36 of Bortolotti and Broom's paper, they use several studies to argue that ethnic minorities and migrants show higher rates of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, and that people living in urban areas in general display a higher level of paranoia. My goal is to find whether these factors, as well as other social and cultural conditions, contribute to the likelihood of a person developing a gambling disorder, as well as the severity of a given gambling disorder. Gambling disorders are clearly different from psychotic disorders, and the economic and legal availability required for someone to gamble means that certain socioeconomic groups in specific states will be more likely to gamble. And national data shows that some ethnic groups are more likely to develop a gambling disorder. A 2009 study from Alegria et al. That was part of a nationwide addiction survey found that 2.2% of Black Americans and 2.3% of Asian/Native Americans in the US had a gambling disorder, compared to 1.2% of white Americans. The study also found that while the prevalence of gambling disorders differed between races, the onset and course of symptoms did not. A base level analysis through the scope of Bortolotti and Broom's paper would argue that Black and Asian/Native Americans face certain social, epistemic, or economic issues that lead to a higher prevalence of gambling disorders in their population. I would first like to argue that the 2009 study I am referring to makes a mistake in grouping Native and Asian Americans together, particularly because many Native American reservations also have casinos, which means that people living on those lands have much more access to gambling in general and would thus logically have a greater chance of developing a gambling disorder. I also believe that education quality and socioeconomic upbringing offer a possible explanation for why Black Americans have a higher prevalence of gambling disorders. It is an unfortunate truth that due to systemic issues, many Black Americans do not have access to the same quality of schools, are more likely to be raised in a single-parent household, and are born into worse economic circumstances in comparison to their white counterparts. All of these factors could have a significant impact on an individual's risk tolerance, their likelihood of making poor financial decisions, and their ability to get help before a disorder becomes more severe. So, to end this video, I would like to ask a question. How does reason come into the equation? Technically, a rational person would never gamble at a casino, given that all games offer the house a slight edge at the very least. Clearly, humans are not constantly rational, but does a consistently irrational sequence of actions in the form of continual gambling imply a mental disorder in and of itself? Does this offer proof of a lack of reason in any individual? Or is it simply a series of uninformed or bad decisions? Does it make a difference? These questions are meant to be difficult, and I think they illuminate how and why gambling disorders are so difficult to treat and why gambling addicts are the most likely to attempt suicide. Let me know what you all think, and thanks for watching.